Today on the Grid Snaps podcast, the lost performance of Andy Serkis. And welcome to the Grid Snaps podcast. Rob Howard here with both co-hosts. It's always great to get both on at the same time. We have Patrick and Kip Carbone. So welcome to you both. Kip, it's been a little while. How are things?
Yeah, it's been a long while. Things have been busy, productive, and hopefully settling down in the near future so I could be on air more often.
Excellent. See, unlike myself that ran off into the safe, warm confines of academia, Kip continues to work in the game industry proper and is therefore quite busy. Actually, I'm actually incredibly busy as
You're
well.
busy. You're doing amazing stuff, so...
I'm actually, my whole thing is Wednesday to Thursday is the gauntlet, where I basically have... What's weird about being a professor is that, at kind of first glance, you look at your schedule and then you ask when are you supposed to be. This is an actual conversation I had where I go to my department head and who's truly my boss. You sort of have that person and then you have colleagues that it's just a different structure. And I asked, well, when do you expect me to be in the office other than obviously to teach? And he's like, I don't keep track of when you come and go. I just kind of expect you to be around. Right. And so that's, so at any given moment when I'm not teaching, I could be literally doing anything I want. Now, the rub here, what you learn very quickly is that your time is filled very, very fast with everything else that you have to do. So some of it is, of course, preparing for the classes. Part of the reason why I was hired was to do a bunch of new things that hadn't been done before at Purdue. So that's all fresh content. So that's most of my time right now. And then I advise a lot of students. Students come by with questions. That's like a huge part of time there. And then there's kind of various other things like committees and do this or that. And soon you realize you're busier than you were when you had kind of a quote unquote proper job. But the difference is that okay, Monday at 3 p.m., if I want to just be I'm just going to go hang out in the coffee shop for 3 hours. No one's going to stop me. You know what I mean? It's not or if, a given Thursday at 1 o'clock, if I need to go do, shop for aluminum siding or what have you, right? I can go do that. That sounds like the most boring thing in the world. It is. It kind of is, actually. That should be a hint at the sort of things I'm doing right now. But, all right, so why we have gathered here today is to talk about a legendary game, a game that I think is really important, historically, but I have to say is a very strange trip to play now, and that of course is Shenmue. And by the way, since my opening sort of thing was a little more oblique than usual, I say the lost performance of Andy Serkis because there's a character in Shenmue who's essentially the main boss that you face. Not the one you think is the main boss, which is another kind of weird thing about the game, but the one who truly serves as the main boss. He's basically an Andy Serkis character. He's like a Gollum. He's like all those characters that actor plays, kind of with the weird voice and the sort of weird walk cycle and all the rest of it. That's why I made the oblique reference. But so before we take our kind of opening break, I think it would be good for our audience to know what they're getting themselves into today. So let's talk about our experiences with Shenmue. Kip, you can go first. What's your experience with Shenmue?
I thought it was Onimusha, and then and I said, yeah, I know all about that game. And then I went to go look at it today, and I realized I'd never played this game before, and I have no experience with it whatsoever. So I'm going to sit back and let you two fine gentlemen talk all about this.
And so what we have, this is good. We have a totally fresh perspective. That's how I'm going to spin this. Patrick, your experience with Shenmue.
Yep. So what was it, like 20 years ago or something like that? It was announced that the game was coming out for the Dreamcast. It was the brainchild of Yu Suzuki, who was the mastermind behind Space Harrier, Afterburner, Virtua Fighter. So I just knew it was going to be good, picked it up day one, and when it wasn't being cheesy funny, it was actually pretty boring.
Oh dear. Yes, what you'll find as we continue this conversation is that this isn't necessarily one of Patrick's favorite games. So now we go to me. Of course, I only knew of Shenmue in 1999 as a legend, right? Because that was my freshman year of college. I certainly had no money to buy game consoles, and if I did have money to buy a game console, I would have been a total pleb, as my daughter would say, and I would have bought a PS2 because I would have had no idea. Well, I knew the Dreamcast existed, but I think like a lot of people, I was like, boy, Sega's weird. They're doing weird stuff. They released what's the deal with the Saturn? What was the deal with all that? I would have just been like, nah, I was gonna get a PS2, right? So that, and actually 1999 was kind of the deadest sort of time for me gaming, because it was when I was like a freshman in college for music, and like the attitude was like, this is all I do, like I think my gaming was just like emulation on the PC for that like 1 or 2 year period of time. So I totally missed it.
That's a shame, because Dreamcast games had really good music. It would have been a great fit.
No, I agree. Especially, I do have a Dreamcast now. It's one of those systems I went out and got later. But yeah, I knew of Shenmue as a legend, as a kind of a legendary game. But years go by, and honestly, Patrick, I have to say, I think from I got into the Yakuza games, and you would always you and some of the other mutual friends that we have would always use the Yakuza games as a way of making fun of Shenmue. Like, this is Shenmue done correctly. This is like such a better version of Shenmue, ha ha ha, right? And of course, me being a contrarian, I kind of got interested in Shenmue then as a result of hearing it mocked, when compared to the Yakuza games, which we love and we podcasted about. In fact, I think you were both on that podcast, so go back and listen to that one if you are so inclined. But it made me really darn interested, and then kind of the coup de grace for me was when, even though I own a Dreamcast and I can go and buy Shenmue on the Dreamcast and all that, they have that really nice Shenmue 1 and 2 thing on the PS4. You can get it now. It's like $20 or sometimes on sale, $15, brand new. It's a really nice sort of remaster. It's not a remake, but it is, a nicely done remaster, and you get both the first two games. And of course, Shenmue 3 came out. So if I was ever going to check that out, I certainly wasn't going to do it until I at least tried to play the first two games a little bit. So it got put on my Christmas list in good old St. Nicholas. After he got done punching heretics at the Council of Nicaea, which is what the real St. Nicholas did, by the way, he delivered me that Christmas gift. Church history, that's something you wouldn't hear on the Grid Snaps podcast, but you did. So, all right, that brings us to our collective experiences with Shenmue, and somehow I have found myself in the bizarre position of being the one that's most familiar with the game today. So that's kind of funny. But when we come back, we'll dig more into Shenmue right after this. So, Kip, there are many ways our listeners can contact us. Let's start with you, Kip. How can they contact you?
You can hit me up at nervouspixels@gmail.com, or on ArtStation at nervouspixels, or on Twitter at nervouspixels.
Awesome. And people can track me down on the Twitter at Roho Games. They can track me down on my portfolio website, rohogames.com. I also have a blog there that I try to keep updated on the regular. I'm also on Instagram, RohoGames80, and please support my little itty-bitty Facebook page, Roho Games on Facebook. I think it's got my mom, some family members, and like a cat on there. So please find me on Facebook. All right, and welcome back to the Grid Snaps podcast. I gotta do this. Patrick, you were on the last show. I did this live. You gotta give us 5-star reviews. Yes, I'm gonna be that obnoxious person. You gotta give us that great review. Why? Because it increases our ranking in the search algorithms. And then, what happens, Kip, is that we start getting huge money, right? And then all of a sudden we can both retire, and Patrick can sleep even more than he does. Actually, no, it's not about that. It's about getting listenership, which makes us, enjoy this process all the more. So please do consider doing that. So, Shenmue, 1999, Dreamcast. I think,
Dun, dun, dun.
Patrick, what I kind of wanted to go to you with right away is that here's the thing I think people don't realize when they look back at Shenmue is that, look, Grand Theft Auto 3 hadn't happened yet. And really, we hadn't had an example.
That was right before it, right?
So Grand Theft Auto 3, the research department is on the case here. I think it's important.
That was like winter of 2000, right?
Yeah, Shenmue definitely preceded Grand Theft Auto 3.
Right, in October of 2001 for Grand Theft Auto 3. And so really, we hadn't had as gamers this sort of immersive open world. You can just sort of roam around a town. And while I don't think Shenmue quite does that, it does it a lot closer maybe than most other things before Grand Theft Auto 3. And so I think your perception of it in 1999, especially as a new Dreamcast owner, would have been maybe you would have been kind of blown away by some aspects. Do you agree with that, or were you just like not blown away?
Well, yeah, because I mean, you could even walk into some buildings. I remember showing Shenmue to a friend, and the thing that he was really blown away by is that it had real-time shadows. He just like kept walking around in circles, just admiring the shadows cast by the character on the ground.
It's funny you should mention that. When I was playing the game, I've been playing it pretty constantly. In fact, I completed it today, as a matter of fact. I completed and even got into a tiny bit of Shenmue 2, actually. I pointed out the real-time shadows to my wife, and it's one of those things you point out, and like the layperson observer just looks at you like you're the dumbest person alive. Like, they go, look, those shadows move. and it's just like the response you get is like, wow. Right?
Yeah, but see, that's when you have to explain that before this game, shadows were just like a circle under the character's feet. In every other game, it was just a circle under the feet. But here, it's like a real shadow.
So anyway, my overall point, though, is that I think there are certain aspects of this game that was unprecedented at the time, and it's important to remember that, because it's become fashionable to kind of sort of take some pokes at this game a little bit. I was actually listening to another podcast that was reviewing Shenmue recently, and it's sort of like, okay, guys, I get it. Yes, and we'll talk about the dialogue. I think there's some interesting observations that we have about it and why it is the way it is, and we understand it's silly and all that. But I do think it did a lot of things that are actually really interesting that weren't being done, or not being done very much when it was released. I think the immersiveness of the world, I think the detail of the city is something that we hadn't really seen much. I mean, we've certainly had free roaming worlds. I mean, Mario, Super Mario, the 3D Mario, Mario 64. That's right. Certainly that provided us a 3D world. Certainly Ocarina of Time, which was like 1998. Gave us a 3D world, but not necessarily one in a realistic urban setting like that, right?
A mimicry of life.
Yes, that's right. And I actually think that's cool and makes the game interesting even now to play. And it certainly wasn't being attempted at that point. So, Patrick, tell us a little bit about the creator of Shenmue, Yu Suzuki, because he has a storied past.
When we were chatting in one of our preparatory discussions, you had mentioned that he was an engineer by study, or am I completely remembering that wrong?
No, I think he is. I mean, the research department, as you talk about his games, they will confirm that for us, but I do believe that is true. He has an engineering background, and I think that is actually an important clue to maybe some aspects of how Shenmue came out. But go on, please.
Yeah. I really just knew that he was the head of the Sega's AM2 division, because back in that day, Sega had like their AM1 team and their AM2 team and the AM3 team. I think there was maybe even an AM6. I don't know if 4 and 5 ever existed. But AM2 was pretty much considered the premier arcade development team. And I mean, I mentioned some of the games they made before, but Virtua Fighter was a huge hit. And then, of course, there was all the things that came off of that, the entire Virtua Fighter series, Fighters Megamix. I don't know how much involvement he actually had in all of the various spin-offs, but just really a hugely influential team at Sega, and uh, other companies also followed along and made games like Dead or Alive. Uh, Sega made Last Bronx, which was not made by AM2 but following the same engine. So really just hugely influential, and you can see some of that in Shenmue's fight scenes. Unfortunately, like pretty much everything else in the game, it's dialed back a whole lot and doesn't have the blistering excitement that Yu Suzuki games usually had.
Right, and the research department did return back some materials for me. Yes, indeed, he did start at Sega as an engineer, and in fact was even a hardware engineer and helped develop various arcade systems as well for Space Harrier and so on. So this is definitely someone who wasn't just an engineer, but a very skilled one, as a matter of fact. So let's actually talk about the setup of the game itself here a little bit. So basically what you have with Shenmue, in my mind, as I played through the game, is this is like a Bruce Lee flick, kind of. It's a kung fu movie. Even the musical score, it sounds just like something that you would hear in a martial arts film. It starts out with that beautiful cutscene. You see Ryo, the main character, Ryo Hazuki, walking. It's a very beautiful shot, especially again for that era. I mean, there weren't that many developers that were doing this kind of cinematic presentation. He just beautifully walks through these trees, and it's snowing outside, I believe, and he goes to his dojo, and he faces the villain, Lan Di, who's there to get the mirror, to get a mystical artifact, a mirror from his father. And his father is a legendary martial artist, and they have a fight in which he loses, and then Ryo loses. And actually, my least favorite character in the game, Fukusan, also is easily dispatched. And I actually think Ine-san is actually abused as well by Landi. Landi's a bad dude, folks. He's a bad dude.
And not to spoil anything, but Landi eventually does get beaten by Fukusan.
You are something. Ignore that comment. So anyway, like that's the setup, and what ends up happening is Ryo is threatened by Lan Di. He's got him in a chokehold. He basically says, "I will kill your son if you don't give me the mirror." And the father lets him have the mirror. Then he kills the father, and so that's the setup of the game. It's a revenge story. But here's the funny thing about this revenge story, Patrick. It's the least urgent revenge story in the history of revenge stories. Ryo can quite casually enjoy his life, despite the fact his father was taken from him and all that. And you do. The game, to me, is about having an easy time in Yokosuka, the city that you're in, hanging out in the city, playing in the arcade, like talking to your, girlfriend, I guess, that runs the flower shop or works at the flower shop. I mean, that's the game loop,
Yep.
and it's the game loop for hours.
And then go into work, driving the forklift around. When you're done with work, go to the arcade, chat up the girl. Yep.
And the thing is, what's interesting is I have to say, I rather enjoyed this. I did. Now, is it going to be, trying to the average gamer's patience? Absolutely. Yes, you have to be. I'm going to drop some weird knowledge here. It won't be weird to anyone who takes my classes, and it certainly won't be weird to game design dorks, but there's something called the Bartle taxonomy of players. Have any of you heard of it? Kip Carbone, Patrick, have you heard of this?
Oh, yeah, I've heard of it.
No,
Right.
I've not heard of it. What is it?
So basically what it is, it's a guy, his name's Richard Bartle. He developed the first MUD, multi-user dungeon, and he developed this sort of schema for determining player types. And it's basically like you're either a achiever, a explorer, a socializer, or killer.
I was a killer.
All right.
Back in the muds. That was my sector.
And you can go, by the way, if you're listening to this and you're wondering, if you search Bartle test online, you can take the test. It's not very long. It's a bunch of quick questions you answer, and then it tells you what you are. And I am an explorer. Pretty hardcore. Like, I forget what my secondary thing is, but it's off the charts explorer. So this is actually not surprising that I would actually enjoy tooling around in Yokosuka. Just going up to the vending machine, buying a canned coffee, even though unlike in the Yakuza games where you can do that, they always give you like a gameplay benefit. In Shenmue, when you go and buy canned coffee, you can drink it, but there's no discernible benefit that I can detect at all. Like, it's just something that you can do, right? Like, there's a bunch of interactions like that. You can collect gotcha balls, from the machines. I guess those are collectibles, and you could look at them or whatever. But again, there's no gameplay benefit to this. It's just stuff you can do in the world, and it's got a nice day-night cycle. They base the weather on the actual weather from Yokosuka from 1986, from the time they got meteorological data, right, from the time, from that place, and they programmed the game so that the weather would match what the weather really was. This is a good segue to this. This is why I say, aha, this seems like someone that was really pushing some cool engineering feats. And I think sometimes when that happens, you land on some weird decisions, right? If you're kind of allowing cool kind of engineering ideas to kind of like, yeah, let's get this weather system in. Let's get, these kind of cool game systems in there. I think when you lead with that sometimes, I think that with sort of technical innovation, as cool as that is, I think that can actually make things kind of weird creatively, and I detect some of that in this game. Did you detect that, Patrick, when you played it? Did you get the sense that this is someone that has kind of interesting ideas but maybe needs curation?
Definitely, especially with the whole passage of time aspect. I mean, that was really one of the things that was a drawback, was needing to meet up with and unfortunately I don't remember the game well enough to give a real example, but needing to meet up with someone at a particular time of day and having to go around and pass time, and then the next day have to pass time again until it was the right hour to meet up with someone. So certainly there were ideas at work there, but I did think that it could have been better executed.
Right. So I know that Kip, you're kind of playing the straight man here, quietly observing. Like, based on what you've heard so far, do you think you would want to go run out and get this for $15 for the PS4? Does this sound interesting to you at all, or are you like, oh my gosh, I can't imagine doing this?
It sounds interesting. I would play it on the Dreamcast maybe for nostalgia's sake, just to see what it would be like. I don't know. This one kind of like escaped me altogether. I was never exposed to it. I was exposed to the Dreamcast and played a bunch of games around that era, but I don't know. I would give it a shot. Why not?
I mean, to me, it's sort of like, look, like if you're the type of gamer that likes kind of virtual tourism, it does kind of provide a cool thing because the Yakuza games, I mean, they're more modern and everything, but they're very much it's Tokyo, it's Osaka, and there's a few other locations here and there throughout the series, but it's basically Tokyo and Osaka, right? And those are awesome locations, certainly plenty exotic for most Americans, I think, but Yokosuka is far lesser known as a region, as an area, and so to me it was actually really cool seeing even just residential architecture. Like, you don't see a lot of residential architecture in the Yakuza games. You're in the city, and in Shenmue you spend significant amounts of time in actual neighborhoods. So that kind of took me back to the times I've been in actual neighborhoods in Japan and not just in the city. So I actually really like that. And the game, and you mentioned this earlier, Patrick, like, it does have, when it does decide to do combat, to do melee combat, when it's not quick time events, it does kind of abuse QTEs as well, I would say. Look, it's based on Virtua Fighter. It's based on that technology and that style of fighting. So it's actually pretty fun. And the game does get a lot more fun in the back half because of that, when you have some of the longer fights.
Right. Yeah, early on in the game, it feels like a gimped Virtua Fighter, but that's mainly because the fights are just too short. But yeah, certainly in the latter half, and not going to spoil anything, but a particular fight, yeah, it definitely uh, uh kind of busts out of its mold there.
Right, absolutely agreed. This will be a great time to take a little break.
I gotta give him the funky rhythm. Let me take you on a trip. Let me take you on a ride.
Let's dig into more of the combat. So, basically this game, and the first half of the game is, quick time events. It's kind of doing errands in the city, but it does ramp up at the end with a lot more sort of Virtua Fighter based melee combat. It can get rather tactical. The last few major fights, you have to actually really think about what you're doing. I also really liked how characters kind of constantly introduce you to new moves. You learn new moves throughout the game. They're very kind of generous with the training. But one thing that's interesting is the way the game wants you to train. And this is this obsession with reality, right? If it were a Yakuza game, they would, if they wanted you, if they were like, okay, we want you to train, we want you to fight, we would present some outlandish scenario so you can fight actual people. In fact, there's this Doc Brown type character, and it has to be based off Doc Brown from Back to the Future, like with the hair and everything. And you put on a VR helmet and you just go back and fight old bosses and also kind of, I think, special scenarios. And of course, that's done as a service to the player because, of course, that's a lot more fun. In Shenmue, they want to be realistic about it. And so practicing means you literally go to your dojo and practice by yourself. You are practicing your moves, right? And that dedication to realism, again, it's sort of like when you do service to the player, you're thinking of game mechanics first and you're grafting the story second to make those work. This seems like this was a game made with the story and setting first, and the game mechanics were grafted onto that. Do you agree with that, Patrick?
I do agree with that, and that's actually one of the reasons that I prefer the Yakuza games. Because yes, you do have moves that you learn, but it's real quick. It's basically, oh, hey, here's this bum on the street who happens to know a lot of kung fu, and he teaches you a move, and then you can instantly go use it and start smashing people into windows. Shenmue, yeah, not like that. It tries to be like realistic and stuff.
Yeah, it really does have a dedication to realism that I think does work against it. I would call it sort of anti-service in some ways, right? Especially, you mentioned the time mechanic before. The way it makes you wait, and yes, in the PS4 version, you can look at your watch and time moves faster, but there's many game events that are tied to time. Like you have to wait by the arcade after 7 p.m., and, it takes a significant amount of actual real life time, like not just game time, but real life time to wait from 9 a.m. in the game to 7 p.m. in the game. And hoo boy, that is something that, talk about something that does not age well. That just certainly does not age well, not having some kind of speed time mechanic. When I hate to bring this example up because it'll get me made fun of, but in the Phantom Pain, you smoke that special cigar and time just instantly goes fast. Right, like again, that's service to the player right there. That is exactly service to the player. Is we want to give you a way to enjoy the game. We're going to equip you.
Yep, and I would say that they probably needed something like that. Like looking at the watch, they should have had that in there from the very beginning because originally they didn't. But really, it does just take it's not even the longest game really, but it feels like it takes so much time. And that's why I would say that probably the best version of the game was the one that came out on the original Xbox. I don't know if you're familiar with this one, Rob.
I'm not, no.
Yeah, on the original Xbox, Shenmue 2 came out. It was actually the first US release of Shenmue 2, and included in the package was a DVD with Shenmue compressed into 90 minutes of the cutscenes. So you could just watch the story and then play Shenmue 2, which was actually a much better game, mainly because they crammed more into it.
Right, and I can even tell in the first hour of Shenmue 2 that they tried to increase the pacing. Like things sort of happen in a much faster rhythm. So there's one thing I want to bring you in on, Kip, is I want to talk about the environments a little bit. So obviously you started your game industry career, around 2006, 2007, right? Or was it a little bit before?
2005.
Right. So a lot of time had passed between 1999 and 2005, of course, when you started your career. But let's go back to 2005, and let's say you were tasked, you and your environment team that you were on, with building, out of the old polygons, a realistic city district. How hard would that be in 2005, especially? Like, would that be a major task, or no problem, give us a few months?
I mean, people were doing it back then for sure. I think, just the level of detail, that we consider acceptable now wouldn't cut it back then. It wouldn't cut it now. Wait, what am I trying to say? You would have been able to do it. It would have been far lower detail back then. It would have seemed like, oh my God, this is amazing. It still would have been hard because just the amount of content, you'd have to get, very creative with it and just really, it would still be feasible back then, I think, for sure.
Yeah. But certainly, I guess my point is that this was in 1999. If it was doable but hard in 2005, in 1999, it would have been, amazing for that to have been done.
Yeah, I think it would have been impressive. I think just seeing kind of like, I don't know, all the detail, even though now it would seem kind of simplified, it would have been quite amazing. Undertaking. And from what I've seen of Shenmue, it's pretty detailed and very immersive for the time, for sure. And I think it would be groundbreaking, really.
So one last topic on this game that at least I want to bring up here is I do want to talk about the voice acting specifically because it's very interesting. And I don't mean to say, there's certain games we laugh at the voice acting, right? Honestly, a lot of Sandlot games, pretty much all of the Sandlot games, if you fire up sort of Robot Alchemic Drive on am I remembering that name right, Patrick? Or is that...
Yes, Robot Alchemic Drive. And
right.
I think I know where you're heading. So just as a preface here, because you were playing the PS4 version, which let you choose whether you wanted to hear the language in English or if you wanted to hear it in Japanese with English subtitles.
Yes.
And both you and I are actually kind of snobs in this regard, that we tend to prefer Japanese with the English subtitles. But do you remember what I told you when you started to play Shenmue?
That you absolutely have to use the English dub on this. And I'm certainly glad. Because it is a very interesting experience, to say the least, to use the English subtitles. But it's not like in the same way that when you play Robot Alchemic Drive, which is usually the game when we're talking about what's the game with the most, bad sounding voice acting you think of. I always think of Robot Alchemic Drive. It's not bad in that way. Like, the voices don't sound grating or like annoying or like, screechy or you know what I mean?
Yeah, they're actually, the tone and everything is actually quite soothing, honestly.
Yeah, it's not bad in the sense that like other games voice acting is bad. It's the enunciation and cadence of the speech is super odd, and I'm very fortunate that I live with a language expert, my wife, who knows a lot about the Japanese language and Spanish and other languages, Romance languages, kind of her specialty, but just language period. And when she was listening to this, she made this comment. She goes, these people in this game, they sound like ESL, the English as a second language teachers. When they do cassette tapes for people to learn a language, that's how you talk. You talk like, for instance, if I were to say, hey Patrick, how you doing, man? That's way too fast. If you're trying to learn English as a second language. So I would say, hello, Patrick. How are you doing? And that's how everything in Shenmue is. That's how all the dialogue is done, is in that kind of stilted way. And so it makes me wonder if either they got direction, in that respect, or if maybe some of the voice actors, I did not research this or anything, but did they, do a bunch of that work and therefore had that experience, and so that's how they're used to kind of dictating speech. But it really does have that feel that these are people that are like making, basically language instructional, tapes, for lack of a better word, and that's what this dialogue sounds like in this game. And I think that's why it's soothing, I think, is that, because that type of voice is soothing. So the game has specifically some, famous voice acting moments, right? But I think mostly, really two things we'll mention here, and then we won't belabor this too much. So, one is the structure of the game is basically that you walk around and you have to get information, right? And to do that, you have to ask the same question a million times to a bunch of NPCs, and so that's what's led to one of the viral things about this game. Where can I find some sailors, right? And the reason why people say this is, they joke about
sailors?
Is that Rio has to go to the docks, to advance the story, and so he asks everyone in town, where can I find sailors? Where can I find sailors, right? And it just comes off so odd and so goofy. But I actually don't think that's the goofiest thing. Patrick, you mentioned the insults of Shenmue. So when you speak to a character that's hostile, right? And I think this is a localization thing. Actually, let me just mention this too. Another thing my wife pointed out to me is that like the localization of this game is, he says, Rio will say "I see" to everything. Like, you walk up to like the shopkeeper. It's like, where can I find some sailors? I don't know where any sailors are. And then he'll say, "I see," and he'll say that every single time. Well, this is a language localization issue, because like in Japanese it would be "so desu" or something like that,
yep.
right?
So.
And in that language you can have one phrase or one word that you repeat, but but you say it, you hear this in the Yakuza games when you listen to the Japanese voice acting. The intonation of the voice is different each time. It doesn't come across like the same things being said. It does, but if you translate that very woodenly without localizing, like, okay, sodasne, all those things translate to "I see," you end up with this localization where you're like, "I see, I see, I see, I see" every single time, when, that's not how it really should translate over. I just thought that was interesting to point out.
Yep, and that is definitely an interesting thing, because in Japanese people will say "ah so" or "so des" a lot, a whole lot, and but no English speaker says "I see, I see, I see" all the time like that. I mean,
and you don't even
course,
vary it. You don't even say "I see." I see, right? Like, it's not, it doesn't work that way. It's just the language has a different, kind of feature set, I guess.
Yeah. I would say, though, that the insults in the game are pretty much spot on. Those were expertly localized.
So I'll read some of these. Okay, so one of the now this is a big sort of badass looking biker guy, tattoos, very dangerous. His insult to you is Kiss off, twit. That's great.
Did you kiss off?
Right. And actually, let me see if the research department might help us out here. Let's have a little fun with this. Let's see if the research department can get some Shenmue insults. I don't think you'll be able to hear them necessarily, but the listeners will. If I know my computer audio settings here, let's see if this is anything worth piping in at all here.
Disappear from my sight, geek! Get lost, jerk! Huh? Who the hell you think you are? What? What you want, twit? What pansy-ass geek? Want me to kick your ass? I'll slap you silly, you pansy! Okay, bastard!
So I'm going to share this video just so you guys can see it, since the audio comes through and the listeners will hear it, but I don't think you guys will hear it. So
this is going to be fantastic.
So this is a compilation of Shenmue insults that I just played, that the listeners just enjoyed. Now you guys can listen to it as well. So very, very, very funny. And also, I see that Kippa shared a beautiful shot of Shenmue 2. I can tell that's Hong Kong. That's a shot from that game, because I was just there.
Yeah. And actually, just seeing the screen, it looks nice.
Right on. That's one of the things that's aged the best about Shenmue is actually how it looks, especially on the PS4 where it is up-resed. But you can toggle that off. You can toggle the up-resing off and get more of an accurate depiction of what it looked like in 1999. And even when you do that, yes, it has more aliasing on the edges of the polygons and stuff, but it still looks good. Looks good. The scenes are well composed. The shots are well composed. The environments are well composed. I mean, clearly Sega and Yu Suzuki's team put all the chips on the table on those environments.
And they certainly had plenty of funding for it, too.
Yes, and we should probably mention this as we draw to a close here. This was, at the time, the most expensive game ever made. Which, of course, now that record's been just blown out of the water every which way. But back then, it was the most expensive game. And Patrick, you probably know this better than I do. This had to have been Sega's attempt to, make a killer app, so to speak, for the Dreamcast, right? That has to be it.
Well, I never perceived it that way. I don't know if Sega intended it that way, because there were already a lot of killer apps for the Dreamcast. Sonic Adventure, Soul Calibur, etc. It was definitely extremely ambitious. They were trying to put out something that would be unforgettable. And I'm actually trying to remember if it was the first multi-disc Dreamcast game or if there was another one before it. But it was certainly just the number of discs alone. It was the biggest Dreamcast game that had been released. But I wouldn't necessarily say that they were trying to put out. Usually when we talk about putting out a killer app, it means that there isn't one already there. So yes, it was intended to be a killer app, but not due to lack of other killer apps.
All right, folks. Well, thank you for listening, and hope you enjoyed this. So, until next time, stay on the grid.
And keep blowing.